Hi, welcome to the Wide Open Road Arts Roving Conversation series. Today's conversation is with Geoffrey Smith. Geoffrey has won high acclaim for his documentary filmmaking, including a double Emmy for his films The English Surgeon and Presumed Guilty. We met Geoffrey in the Castlemaine region where he now lives and were interested in both his professional practice and his thoughts on the sustainability of practice for creatives in the current social, political and technological climate. Okay, so today we're talking to Geoffrey Smith, who's a documentary filmmaker who's currently living in Castlemaine, having spent quite a lot of time overseas. So Geoffrey, we'd just like to start off by asking you a bit about your history as a filmmaker, how you came to it.
That's a good question, because I think the genesis of it totally informs my whole career, really.
Okay.
I did film out at Rusden State College, which was a teachers' college here. The cool kids went to Swinburne and us poorer suburban kids went to Rusden. But there was also this great literature department out of Rusden, and I had always got an interest in, the big archetypal texts of life. So it was great to get into Joyce and Dostoevsky and all these people.
Great.
But then I entered the film industry sort of thing, and I didn't find it very rewarding or redeeming. I think I had a sort of naive vision of film and art coming out of school, but then a big feature film is very much like a machine. It's like really, there's just a few creative people and then there's a whole lot of slaves, and it was wasn't that nice, actually. I thought it was very like morally and even financially bankrupt. It was full of like smoke and mirrors, and I just didn't like it. It didn't seem to speak to me as a storyteller, which back then I hadn't told any stories. Yeah. So I sort of drifted out of feature film and went travelling and lots of interesting places and stories, and I always had this love of listening to people, and I always sort of seemed to have sucker written on my forehead. People would tell me things, and I was always really interested in their real life experiences. So I started to drift towards documentary, because documentary back then wasn't quite what it is now. I mean, it's still far more autonomous, far more guerrilla activity, far smaller, and therefore, because there's less money involved, there's much more freedom involved. Nobody's actually breathing down your neck because there's not $2 million on the table. Yeah. So that was very redeeming and liberating. But I still didn't have a voice. I just still didn't have a purpose, I suppose. And I made a film about this, but I was in Haiti, a little Caribbean country, in 1987. I'd fallen in love with it because of a film that my film lecturer had shown us way back in Rusden 6 years before. And there was an election on, and I was working with these Haitian filmmakers, and the long story short, there was a terrible massacre of voters. Yes. And some of the same killers came back to shoot at us, the people who just found it. And I was shot through the leg and across the shoulder. A guy in front of me was killed. And it was a very traumatic thing to happen. Absolutely. And you'll find this with people who've had nasty things happen to them. I mean, if they do survive them, of course, they usually say, look, this is the best thing that's happened to them, because it forces you to ask some fantastically deep, real questions of yourself. Like, who am I? I could have got up that morning and not made it to lunch. So in a sort of like way, well, what is my life worth? What am I going to leave behind? Who is Geoffrey Smith at the end of the day? Yeah. And these are really great questions to use as an artist, because you have to find a way to answer them. And my answer was eventually realizing after all the trauma and the PTSD and everything else back in England, I needed to tell that story to get myself better.
So what was the story that you needed to tell?
Well, I had this recurring nightmare of a man chasing me, and I was always about to get killed. Yeah. It was always the same guy. It's probably the man I glimpsed as I was running away from his machine gun, and that just played and played and played in my life. And I was just a wreck. It was PTSD, but I didn't even know what it was called back then.
I don't think PTSD existed.
It was just like stiff upper lip in England, get on with it sort of thing. But it was running my life, and the BBC had this slot called Video Diaries they just started, where the filmmaker was the subject of the film. So it was a real thing that you were going to do anyway, and they happened to give you a camera if they thought the story was good enough.
Yeah.
And psychologically, and just my whole life was just sort of dissolving, and I woke up one day and realised I had to go back. And in my own sort of silly way, I thought I have to find the man who shot me, because I'm not going to get better until I confront this guy in my nightmares, right? Now, it's a pretty white, male, naive, silly thing to do, but it was enough of a trigger to get me there. And the BBC loved the idea. Like, it was the quickest commission I've ever had, you know, like, sign here sort of thing. So this film I made of my journey, which was just, it started out as going back to the place where it all happened, having these beautiful school children surround me that day, and that was where the massacre had taken place. So I was able to cut the footage that my camera people had been using in with this gorgeous love of these kids, and this was a huge moment of healing. And I, across the whole film, my idea of finding the guy just dissolved, because my Haitian friend told me, look, it's probably not the best way to go about it. Let me take you on our Haitian way of healing, because they have to deal with it all the time, trauma and loss and grief. So the end result was a film that I was a different person at the end of it. And I thought, hey, if this can happen to me, this can also happen to other people. So my whole career has been based on the idea that if you can gain the trust of people who are in a difficult place, about to go through, or who are going through emotional, moral, ethical, psychological difficulty, if they share that with you as a storyteller, the narrative of doing that, which is now actually a formal study, narrative therapy has become quite a recognised way of dealing with trauma. But you can do it with film. And so I didn't necessarily have that official qualification, psychological one, but I realised that filmmakers are more like counsellors, friends, psychologists. We can help people through something really difficult if they let you in and we tell their story with them. So it was a huge sort of awakening, and it felt morally redeeming to me. That's what I loved about it. It was art meeting morality, and always looking for the bigger picture, always looking for the best in people.
It's a really different position to the, you know, blockbuster thing, where it's sort of, I don't really know, but you feel like there's a lot of ego. It's like, here is my thing, rather than what you're doing, which is like, let me tell your thing. So, How much of you do you think is in the documentaries? Like, if I was to watch 4 of your documentaries, would there be a thing, do you think? Like, do you still feel like you leave a imprint on it, or is it?
Yeah, look, it's a fiction to think that documentary, because it's real people doing real things, it's still a highly constructed slice of reality. I mean, anytime the camera moves, anytime you edit something, it's obviously a bias. So there's no such thing as unmediated reality. I mean, you would have to watch 80 hours of rushes with multiple cameras before you had a sense of what really happened. But look, it's a constructed vision of things, but I would say I take my cue from immersing myself in the person's world. And if you do that with integrity and you don't get the camera out, and sometimes I've spent months with one particular person who was highly damaged because of what had happened to him. So there's an actual friendship there long before the camera appears. And if you can get that, the intimacy that can be created between director and subject in a film is what audiences love, because we go to the cinema and we can feel that intimacy. Just when you watch like bad reality television and you feel not so good about watching it because you know there's exploitation and ego and it's voyeurism, and it's not done with the right way. It's done like a Jerry Springer sort of titillating sensationalist thing. The opposite to that is a documentary where people have known each other for years sometimes, and the relationship is what you are filming, or the film is that relationship, and that's what comes across to the audience in the cinema, and that's what we get goosebumps about, because there's so little authenticity in our virtual world now. You know, people are craving authenticity because they're living a life that's online and it's not real.
And connection, by the sounds of it.
It's all about connection.
Connection.
Back into something real, which in typical, I suppose, you know, artistic and drama terms, you know, Shakespeare didn't really write about happy picnics in the sun because there's not a lot you can say about happiness, but there's a hell of a lot artists want to say and can say about the struggle of life. So my films are always marked by people who it's a moral fable. They're not just it's not just a literal story of a doctor or somebody. It's a moral fable about the struggle we all have to do the right thing.
Yeah. So it sounds like information is not its primary purpose.
No.
There's a sort of ethical and moral, but also you talk about this sort of the component of trauma. Would you say that's a strong theme running through the films you've made?
Yeah, because in drama terms or archetypal terms, you know, you have to have someone struggling against something.
Yes.
There's got to be something at stake. And I use the drama model a lot because it's the best way to tell stories. I mean, with people who've sat around campfires and written things down for millennia, and if you look at the classic storytelling model, there's, you know, the hero's journey or the Joseph Campbell stuff or the arc, and it's what docs for a long time didn't do was they told stories in more of a literal, journalistic, information-led type of way. But if you combine an authentic true story and you film it as it happens, like a low-budget drama, you know, you see it from their point of view, you use voice-over from the character, not from some voice of God. If you construct your documentary more like a drama story, tension resolution, you know, what's at stake, will they get there? And the medical model, just to give you a classic one, which is why I like medicine, you know, there's a problem, there's a process, and there's a solution. You don't know what's going to happen, so the audience keeps watching because you want that person to get better, and there's a doctor who's a hero who's struggling to try and get the result everyone wants, but you don't know. So the narrative, the simple medical narrative, helps you watch a film. And because it's something we all operate on, we all know doctors, we all know patients, we've been a patient, we've got flesh and blood problems ourselves. There's no border, there's no difficulty in understanding the narrative. What you can do then is you take your audience into all the great, interesting places, morally speaking, that come up with that relationship between doctor and patient.
Yeah.
And so the best film I'm known for is called The English Surgeon, and it's about this man's struggle as a neurosurgeon to keep doing the things he does, because he knows he can also harm or kill people with his hands, but he can save them at the same time, and that's an enormous responsibility.
So you mean like the anxiety each time he does it, that he might stuff up and...
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Plus
it's a big weight.
It's a huge moral weight that surgeons and other people carry around, and it's a great one to explore because the sort of dramatic canvas is so big, powerful, and yet it's so accessible for all of us.
When did you make that one?
2007.
Okay. Have you done many medical ones? Is that...
Yeah, I think it was because early on I was attracted to that very thing, that this was a conventional narrative, which was a great, you keep watching. I mean, all films, I think, benefit at least from having a narrative that you want to know what's next. But underneath that, the real film story, as I call it, the thing where the universality of it connects with an audience, is because we're not all doctors, we don't all necessarily have that particular medical problem, but what we do have is decisions every day about what we do with our life. You know, do we ring our mum and say we love her? Do we smile at the bus driver instead of scowl? Do we help a friend, or do we operate in a selfish way? All those moral decisions are always inside the type of thing that surgeons wrestle with. You know, if I go this little further distance, I can hopefully save them, but I also take a risk. So am I a coward if I don't go there, or am I, being crazy by going that extra step? They're juggling this thing on a life and death basis every day, so it's really easy to get into that dilemma, and that would be the other thing that characterises my films. There's always a dilemma about what to do.
The protagonist is,
because if you present the audience with a dilemma, like, do I do this or do I do that? And the key character, or indeed maybe some of the characters, have to make a decision. Audiences, in your mind, you've already thought, well, I'll do this, but you want to keep watching to see what they do. I mean, and so dilemmas are a filmmaker's best friend, I think, because they're really ever present and they show you how other people deal with life.
How do you think that transfer works with your audience? Transfer of information. Do you think they're consciously relating to what they're watching, or do you think it's something that might happen later?
No, I feel strongly like in good drama films that there's three things. There's the audience member who is actively constructing their narrative alongside the film. If you exclude that, which is what a lot of television does, because they talk to you as a voiceover, they tell you what to feel, they tell you what to think, because they're treating you like a child, that excludes that participant feeling from the audience. You don't create your own narrative because you're being told what to think and feel, right? The best films plug you into the story, which is why husband and wife, best friends or whatever, can come out of a film and have completely different ideas about what it was and what it means and what it touches, because they're being plugged, they plug themselves into the story in a way that only you can.
I feel like there used to be, I feel like there used to be a lot more space in films for you and documentaries and everything for you to.
That's right.
Yeah, like
space.
Now there's no space.
That's
and
right.
Everything's so fast and in your face.
And it's always this voiceover, which, because the commissioners just feel they're talking to dummies, and it's like so condescending to me, that type of communication. It's not true. People have very sophisticated ways of dealing with things, and they much prefer being involved where you make up the story. I mean, the classic one is the monster film, where the best monsters are in your head and my head and the other person's head, and we will construct the scariest monster, but we don't need to see one. We might hear it, we might see it, what happens when people get involved with this monster, but if the filmmaker doesn't show you the monster, you, the audience, will create the worst one.
It's like Blair Witch Project.
Exactly.
It's like,
or it wasn't
And so that's why those films are powerful, because you're necessary to the film. You're not just a sort of passive observer, you're actually part of that triangle. So there's director, story or character, and audience to me.
One of the things that I'm interested in is sort of like the role of the artist in society. How do you feel? What do you see your role?
How do you reflect?
Yeah, you have to be careful there. I would say we are storytellers, and society needs storytellers. It's always needed storytellers, because people need someone to help them make sense of things. And narrative is the best form we have usually of making sense of the world.
Yeah. Why do you think narratives are more powerful than, say, facts and information in that respect?
Because it usually, if it's any good, it has an emotional, psychological element to it. And facts, you can put the same facts in a newspaper article and the same facts in a 10-minute piece about autism, where you feature young children with autism and mothers trying to help them, right? But the same information will be in both. Even the same script would be on the newspaper thing. But the emotional impact of seeing that child and that mother or father or whatever it is infinitely bigger than just reading it as a piece of information. So information's useful, it underpins things, but it's never going to change voters or hearts or for audience members. I mean, all politicians know that. It's about tapping into fear in the case of politicians often, but emotions in the case of a filmmaker. Yeah.
Very powerful then. You understand your own power as you're making.
Yeah, and I think you have to be extremely responsible about that. I have a absolute moral contract with the audience, and I would expect they have one with me, and I have one with my contributors. So it's built on something you need to examine all the time. You know, the tendency can be to ignore one of those contracts and make things seemingly more, I don't know, sensational or cut corners or cheat or lie or exaggerate. Well, sooner or later, there's something, the audience will feel there's something not quite right, or the contributor, that relationship between director and subject will break down because there's a sense of exploitation or manipulation. Exactly, that's the key word.
Is that something that you outline with people before you work with them? Like, do you explicitly say, you know, this is how we do things, and sort of outline our contract?
Basically, I have to go in, because media as a catchphrase has just got such a bad reputation. You know, it just keeps going downhill with fake news and with the lack of care and respect given to people and their stories, the sort of machine-like voracious nature of the industry, which just sucks the life out of things, and there's no time to build trust and rapport with characters, which is ridiculous, because that's where you get that magic in the end, if they let you into that world, because all of us as audience members love that sacred sense almost of being led into someone else's universe and that beautiful intimacy you get.
So where's the documentary sort of industry at the moment, say, compared to when you started? How's it
going? It's been renaissance since 20 years ago. Firstly, the digital revolution took it out of being a clumsy, expensive, more or less medium where real film and heavier cameras and things had to be employed. Now, on this device, people are making feature films on phones. The complete dissolving of technical barriers. I mean, we can give this plus editing software to 10-year-olds, and they'll know more than I do in a day, and they're already out there doing their shit with this stuff, which is so liberating in one way. What they won't necessarily have, though, is because there's so much content produced. Cinema or storytelling is a language, particularly the visual form of storytelling, where words, you're trying to use less words and more pictures. So that language, like French, German or Spanish, is something you need to learn and practice. And the more practice people get making films, the better they will get. So I always think of it like that. I tell students, go and listen, in inverted commas, to the masters of this. Whatever director they like, go and watch all their films. Go and analyse how they put that film together, because then you will start to learn the language of cinema, which is the same language for documentary. There's no distinction there. So we've got this huge revolution in the digital capacity to make things happen. Everyone can be a filmmaker. The glut of content that comes out of that is sometimes a problem, but largely not, because good things will continually rise to the surface. People, and along with the net, which has given rise to Netflix and the streaming platforms, I would argue largely that they've been massively important in taking high quality feature documentaries into the homes of millions and millions of people that would normally not see them. So they've put documentary on the map as probably now the sexiest, newest genre for a lot of people that would normally have not thought documentary was for them, because the word documentary, when you say it, it's a bit old-fashioned. It's like, is it a political polemic and black and white, and is it about... People think it's natural history. They think it's animals and reportage and David Attenborough. So it's got a sort of funny feeling, but the moment they see something on Netflix like, Making a Murderer or Wild Wild West or something, they go, that's a documentary. And it's like this explosion, this awareness of like, oh my goodness, I have to watch this stuff. Because, again, as I said before, people are craving that authenticity of real stories.
Yeah.
But they're getting emotion as well. They're getting the same drama, kick and involvement, character arc, character change, tension resolution, real emotion that's somehow more piercing because this actually happened.
Yeah, it's emotion and sensation, isn't it? And sort of the spectacle that you can get from cinema.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole experience.
That's right. It's a whole experience.
Whole brain experience.
And if you couple that with true life, which is, I think, as I said before, is all about the need we have to be trying to get back to something authentic in society, then documentary brings all of that together. It's a holy grail of authenticity and drama storytelling. And docs have cleverly, people like the Weinsteins, believe it or not, marketed a famous film called Thin Blue Line back in the early 90s. They didn't say it was a documentary. They put a poster up, they gave it a name, they cut a sexy trailer, and they said to themselves, look, let's just don't use this word, this kiss of death word. And they banned the director from using the word documentary in any interviews he gave. And that was a very successful film because people went into the cinema not expecting it to be true or not expecting what they saw. So cleverly, some people have realised that they can market, push, promote their documentaries as films, not as documentary, just films, non-fiction, or call it, observe reality, or there's a whole bunch of words people use.
But it sounds like the accessibility of documentaries has changed, and the both in terms of watching them and in terms of creating content yourself. Do you think that what the audience wants has changed over the last 20 years in that period?
TV commissioners, and thankfully less and less people watch television, which I think is great. Long live the death of terrestrial television. They would say yes. They would say, you have to explain more. You have to tell everybody everything, because they feel that they're so desperate for an audience.
Make it easy.
That the digital world has fragmented things into 500 channels, so there's 500 times less chance that someone will watch your channel. So they have to dumb it down as they believe, or make it the lowest common denominator.
But why do they think that's
because
what is it about
they supposedly rely on market, analysis or information.
Okay.
I would actually argue the opposite. I would say that any person with any integrity, artistically or otherwise, has turned off television. They've lost most of their viewers. They've even lost my parents, who are 85, who watch the ABC religiously, but now say there's nothing on except repeats, and they're on the Netflix. They watch Netflix. That's all they do. So if they can't hold an 85-year-old the ABC, they've got very little chance. And I sympathise that it's hard to compete with Netflix, massive scale of budget and all the other things, but they've lost the plot. So the question that you asked is really, has the audience changed? I think the audience has got more sophisticated. I think therefore we as filmmakers need to treat them much more carefully in that sense, because they're more discerning, they've got more platforms, they're going to want to digest faster material as much as anything else, because on the train or the bus or whatever with a phone they might have 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. They won't have the time or the circumstances around them to watch something long form. So there's been an explosion of short form material, and whether that's a different audience, not necessarily, but it's a different expectation they have about that short or that piece of stuff they're watching. And the other big thing is the rise of the cause-driven activist film, where Inconvenient Truth is probably the most famous, right? So you're getting, particularly in the US, where you've got enough people and enough of a group of people, a niche audience, to say well, we want to film about climate change. We want to film about the threat to the planet.
Yeah.
And so they, with social media and the internet, and all of this depends on being able to communicate amongst individuals.
Yeah.
The power of the net is that people can come together and say, the group here in Castlemaine will say, well, we can get 500 signatures for people who come along to the Theatre Royal to watch this film.
Yeah.
And the distributors go, wow, okay, we know we can put a screening on in Castlemaine.
Yeah.
And that filters up the chain to the people who decide, how to fund things or make things. And they say, well, Al Gore and climate change, let's put these two together. Basically a slideshow, that film. It's nothing particularly special, but it hit a nerve with many, many, many people in society about the need to wake up to this problem.
Yeah.
So that has been that style of film, whether it's about dolphins or water or sugar or coal, and Michael Moore, he brings himself into those films, but they're largely guns, healthcare, big pressing topical issues are addressed in documentary now. Sometimes it used to be the whole or the domain of investigative journalism, but that's been killed off largely because media companies have just strangled the resources to that. So independent inquiry is now often led by independent filmmakers who have spent years or struggle or archive, or there's whistleblowers, or there's people giving them archive, or there's some leaked report. There's this enormous amount of stuff that's put out under the documentary label, which will find big audiences around the world because they're connecting. Those audiences are talking to each other about, you've got to see this film, blah, blah, blah.
So this positions documentary filmmaker as, it's quite an important role that it's playing, and particularly at the moment, perhaps with the death of investigative journalists.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, there's lots of recognition of that. Not so much in Australia because we just struggle with the size of our population in terms of and also a history of being able to see that material. But I'm hoping to change some of that with putting on documentaries here, and other people are doing the same things around the country because we can. We don't have to have physical film copies anymore. We can have files. All the changes in distribution and showing, and the rise of emotionally engaging documentary means more people will come.
Okay.
And yet all those messages are all still built into those films, social justice, inequality, the environment.
So can we talk about your location here outside of Melbourne? How long have you been up in these parts?
4 years.
4 years. From Melbourne?
No, I lived in huge metropolises in the Northern Hemisphere, London, Los Angeles and Mexico City. And Mexico City was the last one before I came here.
Right.
Just the whole population of Australia in one place.
Yes, very big.
So it's great to come. My mum was depressed and sick, so I did the right thing eventually as the selfish prodigal son and came back home. And that's been the best thing I've ever done. So I don't want to ever move out of this incredible town we have.
So talk to us about that, since you've lived in such massive cities.
Yeah, but I think, I kidded myself that I was going somewhere when I fled this country at the age of 22, but I was just running away. I think that's the truth of it. I didn't know that at the time. But I buggered off, and a lot of people, if you read the literature, a lot of people come back home to wherever they grew up. Some tiny village or some outback place or whatever. People in their 50s make the return journey because that's almost the hero's journey. The ego they've worked out a lot, they've expressed themselves, they've had a career or something, but what they realise is they've got to heal that connection with their family or their place of birth or their origin. And thankfully my parents live here, not in Maryborough, Broken Hill, because that would have been a nightmare. I wouldn't have been able to stay. But Castlemaine is the best place in Australia. I mean, it has this insane cultural richness in a tiny town. You can't go out and not meet people on the street. It's actually quite difficult to just zip in for a bottle of milk because you're going to meet 3 people you know. But that's, for someone who's not had community really in their life, that is so gorgeous.
Yeah, it's different, isn't it? It's being seen, being known, and enduring relationships.
And giving back now. I just see much more of my role, much less as a filmmaker, but much more about helping other people tell their stories.
Okay.
Just this morning I was with this wonderful woman on our board we have with the Documentary Festival. It's all about at-risk kids and narrative therapy.
Yeah.
And that whole thing, as I was saying before, about being able to help people through their own difficulties by literally just getting them to tell their story.
Authorship, isn't
Yeah. Authorship, ownership, and their voice. Someone's hearing and they've got something, whether it's a book, a podcast or a film they've made, 5, 10, 15 minutes, it doesn't matter. It's out there, it's their expression, their ownership and their voice, and someone else has validated it because we can put them all together and show them at the Theatre Royal or whatever.
Yeah.
That to me now is much more rewarding, much more fulfilling, much more real, and it's just that last part of a life where you want to give back. You know, people gave to me when I was young in terms of skill sets and advice. Well, I want to do the same thing.
Very Jungian, the idea that the first half of your life is ego driven, and it has to be. Like we all have to define ourselves through that leaving process. But the second half being really a totally different phase of life.
Exactly. And it's you see the benefit if you just listen to that instinctive voice we all carry around with us. A lot of people unfortunately have it knocked out of them or they repress it. But it's still there, but it struggles to get out. And they're craving meaning. There's a whole lot of people in the corporate world or the business world or whatever that may be really successful actually, but they're desperate for a sense of connection to society or meaning with other people.
So this town, like the richness of the cultural community, is one thing that you've mentioned. But what about what we're interested in is what other sort of social factors might contribute to this being a particularly conducive place for people like you, but also people at the beginning of their careers too who are choosing to live around here, but creatives flock into this spot. I mean, it's a curious question. Why, besides the gold rush history which exists in other towns around here, what is it about Castlemaine, that that means that people can live these lives here? I don't know if you have an opinion.
No, I think there's. I mean, I have that conversation quite often with people. I'm not paid by the Castlemaine Tourist Authority to say these things, by the way. But I would argue that because my brother lives in Hepburn, and I've seen Dalesford over the years go from being a country town, albeit with a sort of interesting, beautiful setting in some ways, but now it's like Venice. It's like a tourist town.
Totally.
It's lost actually almost all sort of normal soul because unlike Castlemaine, and that's what one of the best things about this place, we have a completely anchored working class reality here, which is the old industries which are sort of largely go on the carpets and the foundry and stuff, but there's a huge bacon factory
which employs a lot of people.
Just thousands and thousands of employees, plus the prison, and it's a commuter town, right? Dalesford's none of those things. So we have people coming and going on an everyday basis who work in town or work up in Bendigo. We have people working here outside of the arts, in regular rural operations, plus the bacon factory, plus the prison. And that, to my mind, gives the town sort of a completely normal, grounded sense. Because you wouldn't want a whole place full of artists. That would be just nightmarish. Dysfunctional.
There's a lot though, isn't there?
There's a lot of people.
But it's not the dominant.
The history which you were asking about in terms of why perhaps the people who came here in the 70s in Chewton, the bushland people, they did so because it was they could build anything they liked off the grid, and also it was relatively short distance to Melbourne. So if you put a sort of circle around Melbourne, this was definitely one of those places. And it was that small group of people that then ignited the state festival 42 years ago.
Yeah, I think that
So
probably has had
it
a big
became
impact.
a self-fulfilling magnet almost. Like, oh, we know so-and-so lives up there, so we'll go up there. And you have to remember, it was massively cheaper.
Yeah.
Well,
than
this is what
Melbourne.
I'm wondering, if there's, like what you say, you compare it to Daylesford, you compare it to Kyneton, you compare it to Macedon and all sorts of places. There's undesirable aspects to the city that I think keep people out, and I wonder whether one of it is that up until this point in time real estate has been reasonably cheap. You could live very cheaply up here, and that has to be a huge draw card.
Absolutely.
But also, you know, we're outside of the hour commute zone, so we're just far enough and yet not too far that it seems to be a sweet spot, perhaps. I don't know.
Well, because also we haven't been yet, although it's changing, the sort of suburban sprawl hasn't choked Castlemaine like it has with Gisborne or Sunbury, which is inside that hour band. And there's a lot of opposition to things like that. I mean, the opposition here to pokies or to a McDonald's or to a new supermarket or what was the last one? Pokies. What was the last one?
Well, there was an aquatic centre that everyone opposed.
Yeah, well, so there's an active, and there's a pretty healthy tension there. I mean, there's a lot of older people up here who would look at people like you and I and say, "There, the fuckers have changed our town." Like,
the weather blowing.
Like, the weather blowing. And
I
I don't feel there's any. I am sympathetic to that point of view. As a matter of fact, it would be nice just to put some of them down. I did apply to council for a sort of grant on old people who we're going to lose.
Yes.
Because they're just literally dying about just telling their stories. I didn't get it, but you know, because they'll go. Because people, they're already going, and there's some incredible stories up here about what life was like 80 years ago. You know? The power of documentary is in that witnessing business as well, just in testimony. It's fantastic. Once it's gone, I mean, this generation of kids, you know, that won't have those older storytellers around them. People have had more time and just the wisdom of being alive for 80, 90, 100 years.
I'm interested in the distance from the war, you know, because for me the war felt really real because my grandparents talked about it a lot. My dad was alive in the war, so he taught us about it as a kid, and that meant it just felt real. And I wonder, like, for my kids and, like, you know, progressively generation by generation, it's just going to seem less and less real in the way that, like, I don't know, whatever, things a long way ago seem to us. And, I don't know, I think that worries me a bit. And it makes me think documentary and that kind of thing, you know, it has a very big role in...
Totally. I mean, it's... Peter Jackson, has just done that First World War footage. It's turned it into colour.
Oh, wow.
And so when you see it in colour, all of a sudden it's like now.
Yes.
These people.
That's fascinating.
It's slightly slowed down because they shot it in 18 frames back then.
Yeah.
So it looks and feels normal and it's in colour. All of a sudden it's like, it could be happening. And it is happening. I mean, so that power of being able to connect to this generation from 100 years ago is beautiful. And we do run a risk. Unfortunately, the biggest archive centre here in Australia, because it's been decimated by government funding, has to charge money for its archive. But then it's so expensive that Australian filmmakers can't use it. So I don't blame them because they're trying to stay open. But there's a very noticeable lack of archive-driven stories in Australia by Australians to Australians.
Can we just dig down for a minute what you just said about there's been a lot of funding cuts to filmmakers. So how is it for documentary filmmakers in Australia now, and how is it that compared to in the past, and how do you think things are going to go?
We have to be careful about the semantics because the people can make what are called documentaries for television and they will be paid pretty well in many ways, or at least for a time they will be paid well to make those things, because there's an industrial model there. You know, this is a recognised public institution, even if it's 7, 9 and 10, and then ABC and SBS. So there's a still, films are called documentaries, and there's still an output. There's increasingly in the hands of bigger independent documentary companies, but people who are making those films, if they can get over the problem I have, which is this endless sort of narration-driven stuff, they can make a living doing that. It's very competitive, but if you're, people will find a way into that industry, because it is an industry. It is set up where there's a charter for the ABC and SBS, and there's a certain amount of material has to be of Australians by Australians.
Okay.
If you step out of that model as an independent filmmaker, documentary or otherwise, then you can access state funding or federal funding, which globally speaking, and I do know a lot about the industry across the planet, I mean, we are very, very well served here in the sense of what's on offer.
Yeah.
However, the flip side of that is that because it's state funded, and there used to be wealthy people could get tax concessions in this country by donating to film and documentary. Other than the philanthropic sector, there's nothing like that now. So what happens when virtually everybody is dependent on a state system of funding? It's political box ticking. It's a set of politically correct agendas, or it's a set of gender agendas, or it's a set of whatever the zeitgeist of the day is,
Improving outcomes.
and trying to give as many people some money as is possible. So what tends to happen is it institutionalises mediocrity. Feature docs, just from an archive perspective or from a shooting perspective sometimes, or a travel perspective, they can be quite expensive things. But we don't tend to encourage that, because we're trying to give as many people a break or some money to get their film up. But as I said, what it tends to do is it turns it into it encourages or only allows for a certain standard, and we won't compete globally if we still do that. And also we don't have if you only keep it at that level, people won't be able to show their films abroad, even if they're interesting, because they're just not up to an international feature doc standard. We've got some things are happening and people are breaking out, but for a country of 25 million, we are infinitely behind a country like Denmark, which has just got 5 million people. So it's not a question of numbers, it's a question of the structure of how you look at or in value filmmaking. And I think at the end of the day, that's the bigger one here. Australians as a whole, or the government reflects, if we say the government reflects Australians, art is not terribly valued or seen to be important. It's seen to be something that people are infected with as a virus, and they need to express themselves, but let them get on with that, because we won't really need to fund that, because they'll do it anyway. The tragedy is the power of reflecting your culture back to yourself through the ABC or SBS. That's a proven, but it's difficult to quantify. And we live in an age where people, the accountants and the lawyers and the bureaucrats run things, and they want accountability. They want to sometimes see some hard evidence of something. They want outcomes. So film or story or culture doesn't easily tick those boxes unless you've got the educated people in the position to know that it actually does. But it needs massaging. The semantics need help there. They won't ever be expressed in hard economic terms.
No. And in a lot of these funding panels, they bring in people from all sorts of industries we've been hearing about. And so you've got people who are in the technical or totally diverse industries, making from, all around Australia, making decisions on whether something's a fundable project, and that can leave I would imagine, an art project quite vulnerable to.
Yeah, I mean, and playing the devil's advocate though, I mean, look, no one owes you a living
No.
if you're an independent artist. Why should they? You can always argue that we need more schools and hospitals, right? But there's that's the place of the right people in government to try and safeguard the arts, because it's ultimately the most noble way that people can reflect themselves and society. And I think Winston Churchill, there was a famous story of in the middle of the war, everything's desperate, you know, money's going into bullets and tanks and uniforms, and this Tory MP stands up and says, Mr. Churchill, why are we spending, you know, this $1 million on protecting the, you know, the heritage of our country with books and art? And he goes something like, you know, that's what we're fighting for. I mean, the whole idea was you don't just forget that stuff. It's not some luxury. It's actually who we are. So it takes a certain type of person to articulate that and be in a position of authority or cultural power. Australia in the 70s and 80s had quite a few, Gough even, Whitlam, but certainly some of the people around him understood that role of art and enabled a lot of these things that we still have as institutions to take off. But we now live in a much more ruthless age of sort of economic rationalism, and it's hard for government to see the value of art.
Do you see that changing? Like, what do you think is going to happen?
I think if you just take it's pretty much a global statistic, but you know, independent filmmakers, as opposed to those people working in and out of television where they can get a wage. But if you are an independent documentary person, let's say 100 people make their first film, but then it's something like 40 will ever make a second one, and it then goes down to about 10 or 15% to make a third one, because it's so brutally on the economic front in terms of, like, people have to mortgage houses or borrow money or credit cards, or they call in favours, or they have a child, or they get married and they have other responsibilities, and then it just becomes incompatible. And in the US, there's been a few studies, and a lot of people who still make films come from a relatively privileged or trust fund sort of background.
Which is something to note, because then if they're the documentary makers, then that's the voice that's coming
Absolutely, out. Which is the fear that people have, is that a large parts of the sort of society or the demographics are not represented.
What's the fear with arts?
Arts
in general, particularly in Australia at the moment, I feel, anyway, with the inequality rapidly.
Totally. So we need somehow, you know, again, that's sort of where it becomes down to policy and government. And I'm some old white guy, and that's actually good now to see a positive discrimination towards younger women making films. You have to be careful, because it's not just gender, and there has to be some sense in which there's a merit to their application. But because otherwise it'll actually backfire, and there'll be all these bad films by women, and people go, oh, well, we told you so. But there still has to be that beginning, there has to be a positive sense of discrimination at the front end, so you get more female voices into... Documentary's actually been pretty good across the years, I would say, because it's much, much less male. The horrors of the feature film world, where money is so big and egos and macho behaviour and all that stuff, women have run a mile from that type of culture. But there's a lot of women making documentaries, very good ones, and there always has been. There's much more bespoke, much more accessible.
So the sustainability of it as a as a life pursuit for you, it's been reasonably manageable. You've been able to...
Yeah, I think, look, I came from a place where I could marry up my artistic, moral integrity, for me, with working for the BBC, where I did for 15 years virtually. And that was because at the time, the BBC was something completely different. It was the end of the golden age of broadcasting, really, where we could tell fantastic stories. We weren't beholden to this condescending voiceover culture. Certainly there was a little bit of it, but it wasn't anywhere near what it is today. And we could take great pride in these international, local, important stories for an audience. There were 5 channels almost up until the day I left, or very, very near that. So audience figures were huge because there were just very few things to watch, and people would talk about your film the following morning around the water cooler or on the bus or something. That doesn't happen anything like that anymore. So I was paid as a director at the BBC, and you could earn a living, and you were a respected member of society, and the BBC opened doors and stuff. And so when I left, because it was imploding and it was going, I thought, in the wrong direction, and a lot of people like me did that at the time, I at least had this CV, this back catalogue of things, which I'm blessed to have because I was paid to do it, and I was proud of those films.
And now you run your own independent.
Yeah, I mean, but it's very coming here has been professional suicide, really, in one way.
Okay,
I mean,
so that's interesting.
I can't get the type of films I want to make off the ground, largely.
Why is that? Because of no funding?
Well, we're a long way from, despite being able to get development money sometimes, and despite being able to secure, if the thing gets off the ground, there's quite a lot of soft money in Australia, which, as I said, probably would be virtually the envy of the world. There's a huge tax concession you can get here if your film is theatrically distributed, 40% of the budget.
Wow.
Probably only France and Canada may have even any hope of being like that. Certainly nothing like that in many European countries or the US.
Okay.
But holding out to something that's not voiceover led or is usually of a foreign nature, that is a little still difficult for the funding bodies here. I think they're changing. They realise that if Australians are making the story, that's almost as good as Australians making Australian stories.
Yeah.
But we do live in a largely anaesthetised society. It's so good here, so practically, in comparison to most countries in the world, we are living a dream. And consequently, there's just a lot less stories of conflict and difficulty and struggle and challenge out there. There is. You talk to any filmmaker will tell you that about Australia. Like, the films that are made, the films that do well, that come out of the US are because it's riven with conflict and struggle and challenge and inequality, and all the things that we would like to banish from society, which to a fair degree we have here. And I'm speaking globally, relatively, and there's always room for improvement, but we all know you just don't have to travel far outside of our borders to see how lucky we are. So there's a type of anaesthetising goes on. You need to find stories that are compelling, and there's less of them here because we have less people spread out over a much bigger space. So people are looking for stories abroad, and then there's difficulty in trying to tell them logistically because we're living some distance away, and as I said before, the budget or the expectation is much lower. So it's a perfect storm that slowly eats away at getting these things off the ground. And maybe I've just also, as I said earlier, I'm more actually think now I've just, I've made 25 films. I'm very happy to see and help other people make stories, because I actually think there's more social good in training up or inspiring that new generation of storytellers, because we're going to need it. Society needs storytellers.
Yeah. So you're optimistic with the young filmmakers that are coming?
Yeah, I've seen how quickly they take to the technology, which is great because there's no learning curve or obstacles involved with expensive, heavy, difficult, rare equipment. So there's just this insane transparency there of people just grab stuff and they can go. And there's lots more energy for them, and they feel passionate. The kids, I'm helping this young boy who went to the climate change demonstration the other day, which was so moving and beautiful that 230 people from Castlemaine got on a train that morning, and half of them kids, and then there's 10,000 of in Spring Street, you know, half of them with cameras documenting this, because then some of them went up to Canberra, some of them are saying, well, this is our school project, they're talking to other students, and they've got boundless energy, but they've also got something to say, you know, something they feel strongly about.
Yeah.
So that's really exciting to me. They're at the cutting edge of realizing that tool they all use on social media is something they can actually elevate up and get their opinions out. And you'll get far more viewers on a mildly well-constructed social media campaign than you will on television. Because it sits there for weeks or months, and you get a lot more people watching something on YouTube if it's well socially put forward than on a single screening on the ABC. Much more. So it's more, seriously, it's more relevant to them, it's more powerful to those people, and it gives them that great sense of ownership and sharing.
It's an immense shift, isn't it?
Immense, yeah.
I reckon that we just
I think
we've
gone over.
covered everything. Thank you so much for talking to us, Geoffrey.
It's like, I like talking about these things because, you know, I was given a lot, so I think it's just as good to start trying to return it and leave people with something to think about. And the power of documentary is just so beautiful.